Hello, can you hear me? Good morning. If everyone will grab something to drink and sit down, we'll get started in 5 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. Glad to have you all here. I'm Mike Martin. I'm proud to be the fourth president of FGCU, only for a little while longer, but proud to be here with you this morning. And a special welcome to your campus. This is a longstanding partnership between FGCU and the Dubin Center on a topic of great import to all of us. And it's always a pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of all my colleagues across the campus. We're glad you're here and we know you'll have a productive time. Just a couple quick things about your university. We continue to grow. We continue, despite the fact that some other universities around the country are shrinking, we continue to grow. We're over 16,000 students. This last year has been a sort of a banner year despite some other challenges, not the least of which is we've opened up the biggest academic building on campus. If you get a chance to have a break, cleverly named Academic Building 9 is our water school. And there's a point to being academic number 9, building number 9, not only because it came after 8, but it comes before 10. And I want to emphasize Academic Building 10, which we are seeking this time in the legislature, funding to do at least the first phase of planning for the last major academic building we'll build on the campus. And that building will be devoted to the next great, we hope, I believe it will be great, interdisciplinary, regionally related initiative called positive aging. So the point of saying 9 is here. The point of saying 9 is here. We're very much looking forward to number 10. The whole notion of a regional comprehensive university is to connect to the region it serves in the ways in which we can best serve it. And the water school was our first big interdisciplinary initiative. It's gone remarkably well, and we're very confident. I was in Tallahassee last week. I was making the rounds to the legislature and the leadership from our region, and I'm confident we'll be able, in partnership with all of you, to launch a major initiative that will focus on, as a proud member of the senior citizens of this, people claim that I have a conflict of interest in pushing this agenda, and I do. But we certainly believe that positive aging is something we can all work on and do much better and in a very comprehensive way. So I'm glad you're here. We're all glad you're here. This is an incredibly important topic. This is an incredibly important relationship. And I know of no one that I've touched in my life that hasn't been touched by Alzheimer's. And so we all know that it will continue to demand our attention, our research, and our commitment to find solutions and cope as we have been doing, but coping ever better. So thank you for being here. Have a great time while you're here. I'll turn it over to Lynn Thorpe from the Dubin Center. Have a great day. Go Eagles.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I understand that the sound is not great in the back. Oh, it's better now. Wonderful. So thank you, FGCU, for hosting this. Hello. This is the 9th annual Dubin Center Symposium. We have some fabulous speakers here today. I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping things for the day. The bathrooms are around to your left by the staircase. It's vital that you have your parking pass in your car or else you will likely get ticketed. If you don't have a parking pass, we have extras at the registration desk. There's free Wi-Fi. If you have any questions, you can ask our team at the back corner. We also have books from all of our esteemed speakers today. They are available at our table, and over the lunch break, there will be signings available. How will today go? So we're going to have each of the presenters will come up for about an hour, and following their presentation, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A opportunity. We have pens and some note cards at all of the tables. We'll walk around and get your questions and bring them up, and our facilitator, Dr. Donald McCarran of Memory Treatment Center, will help do the Q&A session. So I think that's about it. Thank you all for coming, and we will have a break at lunch. I invite you to go into all of the tables in the back. I would like to invite all of the caregivers who are here today and who are on Zoom to take note of our caregiver social that we have coming up at the end of March. It'll be right here on the FGCU campus. We'll be doing a gallery tour and there'll be a musical performance. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up to the stage Dr. Jason Karlawish for our first presentation.
Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Do I have a slide device? Oh, so it's you. Okay, it's my slide caregiver. I'm Jason Karlawish. I'm in town from Philadelphia, where I'm on faculty at the University of Pennsylvania, and I co-direct the Penn Memory Center. I'm a physician trained in geriatric medicine, and my practice focuses on the diagnosis and care of old adults with late life cognitive impairment or adult cognitive diseases, and the most common of which is Alzheimer's, but by no means the only disease that I diagnose is Alzheimer's disease. If you want to know more about me, there's a website there. And if you're someone who uses Twitter, there's a Twitter feed as well. You're welcome to visit. So the phrase Alzheimer's is a crisis is commonly uttered. I'm here to tell you why it became a crisis and then give you a message of hope that it's a crisis that we can solve. The key point of that is that there are things we can do right now to solve the crisis. So while you will feel despair, I think you will ultimately feel hope, because there are things that we just have to make decisions about and muster the political will, and I emphasize that word, to do them. And I think it'll become obvious why. If I may have the next slide. The next slide. Thank you. As Lynn Thorpe mentioned, and I want to thank Lynn Thorpe and her colleagues at the Dubin Center for hosting this and for inviting me. As Lynn Thorpe said, I'm the author of a book called The Problem of Alzheimer's: How Science, Culture, and Politics Turned a Rare Disease into a Crisis and What We Can Do About It. And yes, at the lunchtime, I'd be happy to meet with you and talk more about it. And if you want to buy a copy and sign it, I'd be happy to do that. Much of what I'm going to talk about is drawn from this book. There's a whole lot more, though, in the book. Next, please. In the late 1970s, the physician, oncologist, researcher, and writer, Lewis Thomas, who himself was an accomplished essayist, published a short essay called The Problem of Dementia. It would be collected into a book of his essays called Late Night Thoughts on Listening to Mahler's Ninth Symphony. Obviously, someone you want to hang out with at night, right? Anyway, in this essay, in the late 1970s, this physician, researcher, oncologist became aware of the problem of dementia. And he wrote the following, and I'm going to be unable to, oh, back here. If I could have the next slide. He wrote the following: special consideration and high priority must be given for one particular disease, not a disease of the month, he said, but a disease of the century. The brain disease that affects increasing numbers of our population because of the increasing population of older people in the society. Senility, or as it is now termed, senile dementia. The major form of the disorder, Alzheimer's disease, affects more than 500,000 people over the age of 50, most of them in their 70s and 80s. It is responsible for most of the beds in the country's nursing homes at a cost exceeding 10 billion now and scheduled to rise to 40 billion or more within the next few years. It is, he wrote, the worst of all diseases, not just for what it does to the patient, but for its devastating effects on families and friends. Lewis Thomas, late 1970s. Physician, researcher, focused on oncology, but after reading just a bit about what was then called senile dementia, was prompted as a writer to pick up his pen and write these words and go on to write the essay he wrote, published in Discover magazine. What I find fascinating about Lewis Thomas's words is how much of what he said is kind of nothing new. It's just that the numbers changed. 500,000, well, now that number is up somewhere in the millions. Later on, I'll tell you, it depends on how you want to count it. 10 billion, again, that number now is up into the triple digits, billions, and again, depends on how you want to count it. And the emphasis on disability requiring long-term care services and supports, and the emphasis on not just the impact on the patient, but on other people. What's notable is what he doesn't say. What he doesn't say is a word that all of you know, and you've already heard today uttered several times, caregiver. And I'll talk to you in a bit about why he didn't say the word caregiver, but just said the word families. So in some sense, then, let's sum up. Lewis Thomas framed the problem pretty much the way we frame it now, although with some important differences of language. That was 1970s in America, a can-do, get ahead, solve a problem kind of country. Now we are 50 some odd years later. So how well did we do? Next slide. In the early 21st century, 2009, the Alzheimer's Study Group published a short report, which has largely been forgotten, but is an interesting moment in the history of Alzheimer's disease, sort of like the Virginia Charter that preceded the United States Constitution. And it was a gathering of experts to ponder the issue of Alzheimer's disease. It was modeled after the Iraq Study Group, which was a perhaps more successful effort by America to identify and solve a problem, namely the quagmire of our war in Iraq. The opening paragraph of this 2009 report reads, "The Alzheimer's crisis, like the disease itself, will unfold gradually, making it all too easy to ignore until we have little opportunity to alter its impact. The prospect of an overwhelming hurricane never became real enough to prompt the strengthening of New Orleans levees. The result was $82.2 billion in damage and almost 2,000 lives. Concerns about subprime lending never became urgent enough to prompt corrective regulatory actions. We're still tallying the cost of this crisis as job losses and bank failures mount and stock values plummet. If we fail to address the Alzheimer's crisis now, we face the prospect of losing lives and dollars on a much larger scale." And they would go on to lay out their recommendations in 2009. It's a forgotten report, but I think its rhetoric, again, recalls the rhetoric of Lewis Thomas, only with higher octane and even more dark and dreadful metaphors. They're comparing Alzheimer's disease to Hurricane Katrina. They're comparing it to the subprime mortgage collapse that almost took down not just the nation's, but the world's economy. And so it's interesting that the metaphors are natural disasters and fiscal disasters. Interesting, again, framing a disease of the mind as a problem of money and equating it to a natural disaster. So that's 2009. Thomas gave us our call to action at the late 1970s. So it sounds like nothing really happened and it only got worse. Why? All right, next slide. Got to go back to the beginning, I think, not just because history is fun, it's something to do in the evening, et cetera, it's either that or play Scrabble. But I think the past isn't past, it's not even past, it's still with us. And I will argue as we look at the history of Alzheimer's disease and take it up into the late 20th and the 21st century, you'll see recurring themes, and we're set up to repeat these themes. So bear with me. That is Alois Alzheimer's. He was very tall, 6 foot, over 6 foot. There he is with his wife and children. He was a very accomplished psychiatrist, and he was a German psychiatrist who trained in the late 19th century and began to practice in the early 20th century. And I emphasize German because to be a German psychiatrist meant you did two things. You diagnosed and treated patients, particularly in asylums, places where they would go, be diagnosed, and if were sick enough, remain there until they got better. In fact, even stay there until they died in some cases. And if you were a German psychiatrist, you also did neuropathology. Your skill set included that when your patient died, you were skilled in how to take their brain out of their skull, slice it up, stain it, and look at it under the microscope. And in doing so, you had the skill set to say, I followed this person in life, I got their brain in death, and I'm going to put together what I see in death in the tissue with what I saw in life to try and explain what their problem is. This was a very unique approach to psychiatry, different from the French, British, and really there was a non-school of psychiatry at the time in America. And I emphasize it was German for reasons that will become evident soon. He's a nice guy, by the way, Alois Alzheimer's. I think if you met him and hung out with him socially, I'm told he liked his beer, he liked his laughter, he was easy on the religion, enjoyed a good time. I came from a very Catholic family, but kind of de-emphasized that. Next slide. It's true. There's his patient, Auguste Dieter. Auguste Dieter was brought in to see him by her husband, who was at his wit's end in caring for her because of her inability, not just to be a good German housewife, but she was also becoming a disruptive spouse, accusing him of infidelity. And he had reached his wit's end and brought her to the asylum. And Alois Alzheimer's became intrigued with her very quickly for this reason. She was about in her late 50s, and much of the story that her husband told was a story that sounded a lot like someone who had what at the time was called senility, that is disabling cognitive problems, dementia, caused by extreme aging. But what bugged Alois Alzheimer's is that she wasn't old. She was in her 50s. And it didn't make much sense that someone who wasn't old would have the look of a patient with senile dementia. That didn't make sense to this smart physician. And so he admitted her, he took care of her. At her husband's instructions, she was kept there, and he followed her until she died. A little interesting historical aside, her husband was a good middle-class railway agent. The cost of his wife's long-term care, residential long-term care, exceeded his bill. And when Alois Alzheimer's heard word later that he wanted to move her to a public asylum, Alois Alzheimer's stepped in, he had married into wealth, and covered her bill so as to keep her in an asylum where he had contacts, so that when she died, by then he was off in Munich, her brain would be harvested, that's the word we use, sorry, and packaged and sent to him in Munich for staining and examination. And she did die, he did get her brain, and he did stain it and look at it, and what he found was a tangle of neurofibrils indicates a place where a neuron was previously located, and he published this in a case report. Next slide. What he and his fellow German neuropathologists were onto was they were seeing these cases of not yet old adults who had interesting things going on in their brain that they could see using their special stains and microscopes. This is another one of those researchers. His name is Oscar Fischer. You'll hear more about him in a bit. Arguably, Fischer was the better maker of all these people, these physicians. By that, I mean he was a very skilled physician and neuropathologist. If you show a contemporary neuropathologist Fischer's drawings that he did using his light microscope of the plaques that were in the brains of these patients, a contemporary neuropathologist will say, oh, those are really well done. Who's the physician? As if they were done by a contemporary neuropathologist. And in fact, Fischer's work was so accomplished and well respected that these plaques were called Fischer's plaques. And Alois Alzheimer's in subsequent papers would write about the Fischer plaques, which we now know to be the amyloid plaques that are seen in people with this disease. What these researchers were onto is there's something going on here that doesn't make sense. In an older adult with what we call senility, extreme aging, nothing you can do about it, that's just aging. And in these younger adults who can't be older, but look like they have senility, we're seeing this common Fischer plaque finding in many of them. Something is going on here that's disrupting our understanding of this disease as if you're old, it's senility, extreme aging, caused by a host of things, that's just aging, and then these rare cases that were popping in. Next slide. By the way, there are more slides, so I'm going to stick by. So, sorry about that. So Alois Alzheimer's would subsequently see more patients. And I think his more interesting case report is this one that he wrote a few years after the one that everyone knows about. And I just want to read this line. So this is Alois Alzheimer's writing, and he's talking about these patients with the Fischer plaques. And he's saying, my observations demonstrate in an impressive way how difficult it is to define diseases solely with respect to their clinical features, meaning how old the person is and what their problems are. That's doctor talk for clinical features. He goes on to say, it cannot be doubted that the plaques, Fischer plaques, in these specific cases do in all relevant aspects correspond to those which we find in senile dementia. The question therefore arises as to whether the cause of disease, which I consider peculiar, are sufficiently different clinically or histologically to be distinguished from senile dementia, or whether they should be considered under the same rubric. At this point, half the audience is asleep and the other half says, why did I come here? It's a complicated paragraph, but what he's saying is what I already told you. He's seeing a common pathology in people with what we would call dementia senilis, meaning extreme aging, that might be actually what's causing them to have senility. It might not be extreme aging. It might be these Fisher plaques doing some mischief in the brain. This is big stuff. This is revolutionary. And this is 1911, but it's Germany. Next slide. I told you they were all German. There's Alois Alzheimer's, very big guy. He was like 6 foot some odd. There's Emil Kreplin. You're going to hear more about him because he was the leader of this group. He was a very prominent psychiatrist. Because of visual problems, he couldn't do microscopy, but he was a meticulous record keeper and what we would now call epidemiologist. And there's Franz Nissl of the Nissl stain. And if you were a neuropathologist, you'd say, oh my gosh, that's Nissl of the Nissl stain, because even now you use the Nissl stain, and that's the Nissl of the Nissl stain. And if you're not excited now, I can't do much more to help you. But my point is these physicians had access to these really excellent technologies that were allowing them to look at the brains of their patients in ways that no physician prior had ever been able to do. And they were all German. Next slide. This is Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen was a British officer. He also was a poet, and he would serve in World War I. And in one of his poems called Mental Cases, he wrote, "These are men whose minds the dead have ravished, memory fingers in their hair of murders, multitudinous murders they once witnessed." Wilfred Owen would be injured in a blast accident during the First World War and lie for several hours. Piled on top of him were other men whose bodies were dead. Wilfred Owen would go on to suffer what we would now call PTSD and require a period of time in an asylum to recover. He had no evident physical injury to his brain, but for a period of time was deeply wounded in his mind because of the horrors that he had witnessed, as shown also in his poem, Mental Cases. World War I, like most wars, started out as it was going to be a walk in the park. We'll have this done in about 6 months and reorganize Europe. Of course, the rest is truly history. It was a devastating war. It was a devastating war on a number of accounts. One we know quite well, it took Germany into social, political, and economic disruption that would last until essentially 1946 with the defeat of the Axis Nazi powers by the Allied forces. In the interim time, though, the country would suffer devastating political and social unrest, the kind of political and social unrest which leads to governments unable to fund asylums, which is what happened. They began to close them, and certainly to support the kind of research that was occurring in those asylums. So much of the work done by Alois Alzheimer's and his colleagues came to a grinding halt because Germany, frankly, fell apart. So social and political disorder led to the inability to build building number 10, fund it, fill it with faculty, and do the good work that you hope to do in building number 10. So never lose sight of the impact of broader social and political phenomena on the inability to advance social causes that we all agree need to be taken care of. It's a warning. Mental Cases is an interesting title for the poem. Next slide, please. Because in the same audience, when Alois Alzheimer's presented his case report of Auguste Dieter, a biological psychiatry report, I followed my patient, she died, I took out her brain, I stained it, I looked at it, and this is what I saw, a very biological model of disease, was Carl Jung, who at the time was a champion of a psychological theory of mental illness. It had nothing to do with pathologies, Fisher's plaques, it had everything to do with sublimated traumas that caused a person to be ill. And up until World War I, Jung and his colleague Sigmund Freud advanced the psychodynamic model of illness, much to the sort of quizzical responses of physicians and others. Largely, it was focused on sublimated psychosexual matters. World War I changed that in an instant because you had all these young men like Wilfred Owen showing up in the hospital completely without any physical wounds, but clearly quite ill because of psychological trauma. And so World War I was arguably responsible for taking Freudian and Jungian theories and taking them from the fringes of psychiatry and putting them front and center as the model for why people develop mental illness. Another reason why Alzheimer's disease would fade away. The few physicians championing the biological approach were all German. I've already told you, Germany wrecked itself. Meanwhile, a new theory of illness is put forward, a theory of sublimated psychological trauma, and you have to only witness the thousands of men like Wilfred Owen to say, well, this is a very legitimate theory of illness. Next slide, because it only gets weirder. Leave it to America to pick up on something and run with it and overdo it sometimes. The Freudian theory would gain enormous attraction and attention in America. For some reason, American psychiatry became enamored of Freudian ideas. And some of you may remember by the 1950s in America, Freudian expressions and ways of thinking really kind of dominated our culture. There were ways that we sort of thought about who we were and how we interacted. And this man, Will Menninger, of the Menninger Clinic and the first one of the presidents of the American Psychiatric Association, would champion Freudian approaches to psychiatry and other diseases. Psychiatry at one point in America was one of the most popular fields for physicians to enroll in, by the way. It's very interesting. Enamored of this idea that we just have to solve our sublimated neuroses to solve our problems. Another reason why in the victorious country of America, who was the world's leader then and a bit now perhaps, ideas of biological mechanisms of brain disease would be ignored because psychiatry was championing this. It's pretty hard to psychoanalyze someone with dementia to figure out what's causing them to have their problems. And yet, I think myself and other clinicians would say the value of counseling and therapy for people dealing with these diseases is very real, but that's another story for another time. So in America, which could have championed the work of people like Alois Alzheimer's, that wasn't the case because Will Menninger was championing the ideas of Freudian theories of disease. By the way, this is intensely amusing. Freud was fairly European in his viewpoints and very dismissive of America. He hated America. And it's kind of amusing to see how America would be the champion of Freudian theories. Next slide. But it even gets weirder. This is Emil Kraepelin. I mentioned him earlier. For a period of time in psychiatry, Emil Kraepelin was the world's leader of the field. His textbook, a copy of which you see there, was the textbook of psychiatry, written in German, but translated into English and other languages. It was to psychiatry like textbooks such as, currently we use Up to Date Online, for example, were to and are to medicine. Kraepelin after the war would start to change. Next slide. This is an essay he wrote reflecting on why Germany fell apart. The frequency of psychopathic predisposition in Jews could have played a role, although it is their harping criticism, their rhetorical and theatrical abilities. I'm not going to read on. The point was he began to adopt vicious anti-Semitic and eugenic ideas of disease, that the problem in countries like Germany are bad genes and Jews, to put it bluntly. And indeed, he would be a mentor to this man, Ernst Rudin, who would take over his position at the Munich Asylum. Rudin would, of course, become the Reichsfuhrer for hygiene and would instigate programs in Germany in the late 1930s, 40s that involved euthanasia of people with mental illnesses, et cetera. I put Oscar Fischer back there because Oscar Fischer of the Fischer plaque, arguably one of the leaders of the field, was himself a Jew and a socialist. And in the country he was in, at the time, the Czech Republic, would lose his academic position by 1920 because of his religion and politics, and by the 1930s would be imprisoned in Theresienstadt prison by the Nazis and die a year later. His work entirely forgotten, his research entirely ceased. Never underestimate how politics, ideologies, and culture can destroy our ability to solve a problem that we all share in common. Next slide. All right, well, that was a bit of a buzzkill. So we fast forward in America, by the late 20th century, people are beginning to say, we have this problem. We have these older adults who are forgetful, disruptive, unable to do their activities like making a meal, traveling from one place to the other, managing their medications, taking care of their finances, and then all of a sudden troubles with bathing and dressing and grooming, et cetera. What are we going to do about this? And when you took those people to a physician, the physicians were unable to even begin to think about what the problem was. Senility, et cetera, was the term of art. This physician was one of them, Robert Katzman. He was on both sides of the problem. He was a neurologist. He was very smart. He was very ambitious. He was a bit of a lull in his career because he couldn't get grant funding to study what he wanted to. And his dear mother-in-law developed what we would now think, I think, was Alzheimer's disease. And so he was on both sides of the world. He was on the diagnostic side, doing all the harms of physicians then, namely, I don't know what's going on with your relative, and there's nothing we can do. And he was on the family side with his dear beloved mother-in-law, seeing how bad care was out there. He was an activist, fundamentally, Katzman. He was a physician, but he definitely had a social activist bent. For example, he was offered a job in Little Rock, Arkansas at the time, late 1950s, early 1960s, and turned it down because he wasn't assured by the university there that their approaches to segregation would be ceased. And he decided, I don't want to work in a state that still supports segregated approaches to education. So that's the kind of activist he was. Katzman writes this short essay, the title of which you see up on the screen there. It's only 1,200 words. It's an essay. It's not a science report. But essentially, he argues in it that the difference between senile dementia and Alzheimer's disease, senile dementia, extreme aging, nothing you can do about it. Alzheimer's disease, rare disease in young people caused by plaques. This is what was left over after everything was wrecked in Germany. He said that distinction makes no sense. There's a common problem here. It's those amyloid plaques. That's the problem. All those people with senility, in fact, have Alzheimer's disease. It isn't a rare disease. It's a very prevalent disease, and it's a bad disease, and we need to do something about it. He essentially picked up where LLS Alzheimer's and Oscar Fischer left off in 1914. And he made this his cause. And he would ally, not with other physicians, but, next slide, with other people. And I'll tell you about those in a minute. So I want to argue one point that is depicted in this confusing graph, well, not confusing, but what the heck is it graph, about what else was happening in the 21st century. So far what I've told you is a lot more older adults showing up and medicine unable to care for them. But there have been a lot of older adults showing up to doctors with cognitive problems since the beginning of time. Maybe not as many, but the notion that in 1730, there weren't older adults who were confused and not able to, I don't know, make the fire and skin the rabbit or whatever they did to run a colonial house. But it wasn't thought of as a problem. And I would argue that something happened in the 20th century, which I've tried to show here with this graph. And this is the word autonomy. And this is a search of the appearance of the word autonomy in the English language in every possible document that Google can hoover up. And over there is 1800. And you'll see that the word autonomy doesn't really exist until the late 19th century, appears in the 20th century, and then right around 1950, it takes off, meaning this idea that all of us have within us the mind and identity to self-determine our lives, and that all of us should respect other adults' abilities to self-determine their lives, was a fairly modern notion in Western history. And anyone who's a woman or of any other groups, if you will, that were considered unable to do certain things because of your status, I think can relate to the transformation in the late 20th century, that it was no longer acceptable to say to someone, because of who you are, a Jew, a woman of color, et cetera, that there are certain things that you just, quote, can't do. And I would argue that that ethical transformation in Western societies, as it was realized, was one of the reasons why losing your autonomy because of cognitive problems began to be viewed as unacceptable, not something that's, quote, normal, not something that we should just accept as the way it is, like the winter. So that was a cultural transformation that Robert Katzman was living in and working in. And I would say the times were ready for Katzman. Next slide. Because the other event that was occurring was the recognition that those family members that Lewis Thomas talked about weren't just family members. They were caregivers. This is another search of words in the English language. This line depicts the word Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's, and variations on it. And what you can see is in the English language literatures, the word essentially was non-existent until about 1980, the events of which I'm about ready to start to tell you. So prior to that, there wasn't much talk about Alzheimer's. Remember, it was wrecked in Germany, and Germany was where it was going to be discovered, and they wrecked it. But the next line, oh, no, that was the next line depicts the word caregiver. Humans have been caring for other humans since at least the Bible. The book of Ruth is the story of Ruth, the dutiful daughter-in-law of Naomi, who cares for her mother-in-law because they're both widowed. And she says, wherever you go, I go, whatever you do, I do. Now, I know that's often read at wedding ceremonies, but actually it's not a statement of a couple getting married. It's a statement of a daughter swearing to her mother-in-law, you can't make this stuff up, that I'm going to be your caregiver no matter what. But nowhere in the book of Ruth is Ruth called Naomi's caregiver. She's just a good daughter-in-law doing what good daughters-in-law are supposed to do. The word caregiver does not appear in our cultures until about 1980, a few years after Alzheimer's. And it was the construction of the idea that someone who is taking care of someone who has dementia is a caregiver that would be a key catalyst to saying, this is what this problem is, and this is something that we need to take care of, because there are all these caregivers, not just dutiful daughter-in-laws, et cetera, who are in this role, unsupported, unhelped, without any guidance, et cetera. And I would argue that the final sort of string in this tapestry that made Alzheimer's be aware, made it recognized as a problem, is the recognition that there's this distinct role called caregiver. What's interesting about this role is people who are in the role often now don't think they're in it. Well, I'm not a caregiver, or I never thought of myself as a caregiver, or et cetera. So it's a fascinating role that has a label and yet isn't there. All right, so 1980s, Katzman's getting ready to get his work. Next slide. He needs a sponsor. It's not going to be medicine. Medicine has no interest in senile dementia, absolutely none. It's studying the garbage can was the view of what it meant to study brain diseases. Moreover, you can't get the tissue until they die. So it's a really hard, brain diseases were very hard to study because you couldn't get tissue until people died. Every other organ in the body lends itself to being biopsied in some way, except the brain, until recently, and I'll tell you more. Never tell a hard-driving American executive who has a problem that there's nothing you can do about it. Jerry Stone was a hard-driving American executive of the Stone Container Corporation, and his dear wife, Evie, developed what we now would think, I think, was Alzheimer's disease. And he took Evie to the University of Chicago. He took her to the Brigham and Women's Hospital. He took her to Mass General. He took her to Queen Square London Hospital over in the United Kingdom, searching for answers, searching for treatments. He went to the libraries. He looked at the textbooks. He saw the attention to Alzheimer's was just a few sentences compared to the pages on stroke, the pages on headache. Jerry didn't like this. This is not the kind of a hard-driving executive of a Fortune 500 company wants solutions. He had a checkbook, he had contacts, and he found Robert Katzman. And the rest is would lead to the creation of the group we know as the Alzheimer's Association. Because Jerry had the money, Jerry had the contacts, and he got it going. Not really. Next slide. This is Hilda Pridgeon. Hilda Pridgeon, unlike Jerry Stone, Hilda Pridgeon, like Jerry Stone, was a Midwesterner. Jerry came from Chicago. Hilda came from Minnesota. Unlike Jerry Stone, Hilda was born into a simple middle-class family. And her hardworking husband also, like Jerry's spouse, developed dementia. And she, like Jerry, experienced how bad diagnosis and treatment was. Unlike Jerry, she was a housewife, so she had to go back to school at night. She would study at night, get up really early to study and take care of her husband, and then go to work, and then go to school and raise her last child at home, et cetera. Her story is one that almost brings tears to your eyes about how hard she worked. And through it all, Hilda Pridgeon founded an organization to help other, mostly women like her, deal with and cope with this disease. Think about it. Her son tells me she took one of the bedrooms in the house and made it the organization's headquarters. And her son remembers a guy from New York called Jerry calling her up because Jerry heard there's this woman out in Minnesota who's formed an organization that is looking to help families like yours. Anyway, long story short, Hilda and Pridgeon, Jerry Stone, and others, the families would get together and form the organization that we now know as the Alzheimer's Association. Jerry had the money, Jerry had the Rolodex, Hilda, I would argue, had the brains, and she had the template. And I would argue the Alzheimer's Association owes a debt like the field does to Oscar Fisher for what Hilda Pridgeon built. So that was the beginning of, we're going to solve the Alzheimer's problem in America, done by activists, namely disgruntled spouses trying to figure out what to do about this disease. Next slide. So I mentioned Hilda Pridgeon's social position. And here she's interviewed in an Associated Press article from the late 1980s. And she's quoted, "Spousal impoverishment is a huge issue. It's amazing that the richest country in the world can't take care of its older people without impoverishing their spouses. People are going through their resources very rapidly." Hilda Pridgeon herself was not impoverished. She was quite hardworking, but she witnessed how devastating this disease was. When she wrote to Medicare to say, there's no drug that being given to my husband, but I have found this daycare center that I could take him to so I can go to work and he's cared for. And the man from Medicare, and that's what she called him, wrote her back and he said, that's a vacation for you and an entertainment for him. We don't pay for that. That's a letter from the man from Medicare. And you know what? That's still the letter that we're getting from the man from Medicare. He doesn't say it that way anymore, but you can't get long-term care services and supports. It's a vacation for you and entertainment for your relative. Well, you know, it's no, the American family is supposed to work hard and we can do this as a family. Or the rhetoric is hot and bothered and gets me bothered. So that was the position she took. So she went to Congress, next slide, and she testified to Congress. People are afraid. I'm afraid. They're afraid of what will happen to them if they get this disease. They're even more afraid of how their families will cope. We cannot yet prevent this terrible emotional cost of Alzheimer's, but we can and must do something about the financial burden that is impoverishing all but the wealthiest families. She said that to the United States Congress at a hearing in the early 1990s. The hearing was kicked off by Mark Hatfield, by the way. His quote is up there, where he began the hearing telling everyone, essentially, you can see the quote there, my father has Alzheimer's. He brought the room to hushed silence. He was the first, probably the first senator, congressperson to say, this disease is in my family. And that's how stigmatized it was. This has changed, by the way. Susan Cohen, senator from Maine, talks of Alzheimer's as, quote, the family disease. There are so many people in the Cohen family, she says, who have the disease. So some things have changed. So they were on Capitol Hill lobbying for Congress to pass long-term care services and supports akin to Medicare for long-term care services and supports. Next slide. And when they would lobby, oh yes, right. When they were doing this, mind you, this is occurring in the 80s into the 90s when I would argue things had changed in America. In 1980, at the same time that the Alzheimer's Association was founded, this man would be elected president of the United States. And he would, in one of his State of the Union addresses, reflect on the 70s of years of rising problems, falling confidence, the feeling of government grown beyond the consent of the governed. Families felt helpless in the face of mounting inflation and the indignity of taxes that reduced reward for hard work, thrift, and risk-taking. All this is overlaid by an ever-growing of rules and regulations. In that political environment, that was not the environment to expand government. It wasn't. It was not an environment to say we need to put in a payroll tax to pay for long-term care services and supports for all Americans akin to Medicare. And that would be one of the main political barriers to addressing the care crisis, namely a view that the federal government was, well, the 9 most frightening words in the English language were, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. So with that kind of attitude, you weren't going to get a lot of efforts by government to help care for Hilda Pridgian and her family. Next slide. Indeed, Tom DeLay was a congressman when Hilda Pridgian and her colleagues were lobbying, and he was interviewed after they had lobbied him. And the reporter said, though DeLay greeted the volunteers warmly and assured them that their issue was dear to my heart, over here, he cooled when talk turned to the need for federal long-term care. After the volunteers left his office, he explained, that's where we may break ranks. No one has told me how we're going to pay for this. Next slide. This conversation about what is the role of us, the government, we the people, in solving the problem of Alzheimer's began in the 80s with the Alzheimer's Association, was inflamed across the 80s and 90s in American politics and remains unresolved. How will we the people deal with the problem of Alzheimer's? Indeed, the Alzheimer's Association realized this. So around the early 90s, when the Congress, House of Representatives was taken over by the Republicans, led by Newt Gingrich, with a philosophy that DeLay was articulating, namely no taxes. The head of public policy for the Alzheimer's Association would send this memo to the board of directors of the Alzheimer's Association. I actually had the opportunity to review all the minutes of the board of directors of the Alzheimer's Association. I found this little chestnut in the minutes. There's a changing philosophy, McConnell told the board of directors, that stresses a balanced budget, smaller government, lower taxes, less entitlement spending, a shift from federal to state government, an emphasis on personal responsibility. This poses new challenges and opportunity for the association to educate newly elected officials and leaders about the Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's Association central issues, research and long-term care, and to develop strategies to advance those issues in the new environment. What McConnell was trying to say was, we got a problem. This is not the political environment to advance our cause. Maybe we can advance the research cause, NIH money, discover better treatments, discover, quote, the cure, but everything else is going to be a real hard fight for us to get the care that our families need. And McConnell's essentially telling them, you're going to have to re-strategize. Next slide. Just to sort of top off how things, America both recognized and failed to address the crisis, I talked to you about the rise of autonomy as a principle that I think fueled why this disease is recognized as a disease. I don't want to lose the ability to self-determine my life. Yeah, I might be 80, but I still want to do things, okay? Get rid of the stigmatization that surrounds being older as a sort of can't do stage of life. And I think this PSA from the Alzheimer's Association nicely captures that sentiment. My brain has Alzheimer's, it still has hope. It has experience of a leader and patience of a mother. It has lived through injustice, but lives for each moment. It's an advocate with a meaningful mission. My brain matters. I will use it as long as I can to wipe out Alzheimer's. And this is actually a real patient, Joan Aronis. You can look her up. She has Alzheimer's. So it's a very hard driving woman who has seen what it's like to be told you can't do that as a woman. And I'm not going to let the men tell me that I can't get a credit card. My mother remembers being told that. Her husband had to give her credit. She couldn't get a credit card. That was 1960. And I'm not going to let this disease tell me what I can't do. Juxtaposed to that is a sentiment as well, which argues that equal rights for women, as was proposed in a constitutional amendment, would have meant women would get drafted to fight in war, and we wouldn't want that to happen, et cetera. So you have these cultural tensions still in America around just how should we respect and advance the autonomy of people. Next slide. And it only gets weirder. So this is Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Walter Annenberg. As you know, Reagan would go on to develop Alzheimer's disease and ultimately die of it. And his friend Walter Annenberg is quoted in the New York Times about his friend Ronald Reagan. You have a living person who ostensibly is all right, and he's just out of it. And I don't want to see him in this light anymore. I prefer to remember him as a vigorous fellow. And so that's why he was no longer going to visit his friend Ronald Reagan. I would presume, therefore, Ronald Reagan's wife, Nancy. And so this is the social isolation that families and patients experience because people want to remember you as a vigorous fellow and they don't want to be around you. Some friend. Thanks for the ambassadorship. Next slide. Okay, it even gets weirder and odder. So everything I've talked about are social, political, and cultural things. And I've had some people say this is overly political, and we could debate that matter, and I'd be open to that. But I think when the focus is Alzheimer's, I would argue the problems I'm laying out cohere to the facts. You may have different perspectives on other approaches to taxation, et cetera. But the science also had some problems. This is a PSA that was issued by the Alzheimer's Association in 1990. Today, there are at least 4 million victims of Alzheimer's. But for almost every one of those victims, there's another, a husband, a wife, a son or daughter, whose entire life changes with the demands of caregiving. Walter Cronkite, America's most trusted newsman. So what he's saying is this is a big problem. He's using the word caregiver. He's linking the patient and caregiver experiences together. It's a powerful PSA. The problem was scientists were fighting over that 4 million figure. Depending on how you measure the disease, you come up with very different numbers. It remains a challenge today. I detail it in the book. And because we couldn't come up with a clear idea of how many people had the disease, and we still struggle with that, it was hard for policymakers to say, well, what should we do about it? If you can't tell me how many people have the problem, what are we going to do about it? So that didn't help. Next slide. Next slide. So that's why in 2009, the Alzheimer's Study Group said, this is like Katrina. This is like the subprime mortgage crisis. And in some sense, I begrudgingly accept their uses of those metaphors. Katrina, we couldn't stop the hurricane, but we could have done better. The subprime mortgage crisis, that did not come from heaven or hell. We created that. Next slide. So the field's transformed. So when I was started out at the Penn Memory Center, no dementia, no Alzheimer's. You had to have dementia to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Everything else was normal aging or mild cognitive impairment. We would figure it out. And then things began to change rapidly and all at once with the turn of the century, because we began to develop the ability to see this disease not in death when you died, but in life. We could, with imaging techniques, look at and identify the pathologies in the brain of a person with dementia. And it led to this transformation, which I talk about in the book and elsewhere, that you can, before someone has MCI or even dementia, pick up the pathologies in the brain of that person. Next slide. Leading to front cover of the prominent Nature magazine with a headline like this: targeting amyloid. The brain that you see on the left with hot red is a brain full of amyloid of a living human with Alzheimer's disease dementia. The brain on the right is another person with Alzheimer's disease dementia, but that person has received an anti-amyloid drug, and the drug has hoovered up all the amyloid in her brain, rendering her to have a brain without amyloid. This was a headline-making study result that we can use an amyloid tracer to see whether you have amyloid in your brain, and then give you a drug that targets amyloid, remove the amyloid from your brain, and maybe we might have a treatment that can slow the disease, perhaps even cure it. The drug in question there is aducanumab. Aducanumab enjoyed a essentially disastrous subsequent series of studies as a result of a series of bad decision-making on the part of the company, on the part of the FDA. Fortunately, there's another drug, similar mechanism, similar action, which had a much better designed study, which was published last year, which shows that removing amyloid from the brain of someone doesn't halt the disease, doesn't cure the disease, but does, on measures of cognition and function, slow the decline that you see. So we haven't cured it, but we have a treatment that I would argue, when I read that paper, slows the disease. If you take this drug, it doesn't progress as fast. That creates some challenging decisions, whether you want to slow your disease and when you want to stop slowing it. But I'd rather have those challenging decisions than no options to slow a disease. And that's a drug called lecanemab, which should probably be approved by the FDA. Well, it already is approved by the FDA, but it needs full review and approval. Okay, so that's a big breakthrough. Next slide. But next slide. So a drug that slows a disease. I have no fundamental problem with that idea. I don't have a problem with living with dementia. I don't. Of course, a cure would be great for the diseases that cause dementia. Alzheimer's, Lewy body disease, TDP-43, alpha-synuclein, vascular disease. You're going to have to find treatments for all those that are definitive enough to halt and cure. That's an ambitious cause. We've made progress with cancer. Some cancers can be cured or dramatically slowed, such that people live many years. We've made great progress with heart disease, but people still die of cancer and they still die of heart disease. So I think a very rational approach is to say we should view that these diseases will become, to use a word in pharma, druggable, slowable, treatable, but we're still going to have to figure out how we're going to live with some degree of disabling cognitive impairments. And later today, my colleague Ann Basting and others will give you some good ideas about that. There are things, though, that we can do right now. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next. Good, stop. Sorry, it was one of those built slides, which seems like a great idea when you do the talk, and then you're like, I should never have done that. There is no reason right now in America that we can't have a national network of comprehensive dementia centers. There's no reason. France has one. The French can do it. Come on. There's no reason why we don't have multidisciplinary geriatric surgery teams. So after you get your hip repaired, you don't die of delirium. There's no reason why hospitals can't be free of delirium. We have methods to address this. We have proven approaches to geriatric surgery that allow people to get operated on without having their brains destroyed. There's no reason why we can't have a social insurance program for long-term care services and supports. Germany has one. They've had it for decades. Germany, they're kind of like us. We save them. It's paid out of payroll taxes. There's no reason why we can't live the 6 pillars of brain health. You go to the Global Council on Brain Health and they lay out what you can do to maintain your brain health. All these things, the data are there, the science is there, the political will is absent. Next slide. There's no reason why we can't use technology to expand our minds into other objects to care for people. There's no reason. I have patients who, courtesy of, where the hell is it? Oh, this, are able to get around and do things and remember, or the family member knows where they are and so can find them. This is just the beginning of the kind of technologies that extend our mind out into the world and so support it. Next slide. This is my patient, Arthur Packel. This is his wife, Renee. I can say his name and everything publicly because they were on the front page of the New York Times and she's very public about his disease. I diagnosed him when, if you had met him socially and whatnot, you'd say he seems fine. And she would have said, oh, no, he's not. And it only got worse. The earliest presentation he gave was bottom line was unpaid bills and business decisions with his insurance business that resulted in the business being liquidated. They had to sell their house, move to a condo. She had to go back to work. She hadn't worked since youth in order to bring in some money. Financial problems can be the earliest way that these diseases present. Next slide. And indeed, here's a fascinating study. And what this is showing is that vertical bar is a diagnosis in the medical record of Alzheimer's or related diseases. That the little dash marks are those people diagnosed later. That's their credit scores. And the fact that they're above the horizontal line is telling you that they were showing problems with credit and related signs of financial decision-making years prior to the doctor finally putting a label on them. So in a sense, the banking and financial services industry is on the front line of diagnosing these diseases. They just have to figure out how they're going to work with the medical community and the patients and families. Next slide. So someday, with the biological markers that you can now measure in blood for alpha-synuclein and TDP-43 and amyloid and tau, we might have bus kiosks like this. This is 12th Street in Philadelphia, 12th and Market. Know your risk, know your A1C, diabetesa1c.org. This is an ambulance. This is Hank and his wife. And the ambulance says, Hank, diabetes complications are coming to get you. I assume the ambulance is about ready to run over Hank and his wife. It's kind of gross. But the point is that if Hank knew his risk, he wouldn't have an ambulance racing into his living room. And you can imagine someday a bus kiosk, know your risk, know your p-tau 217, Hank, Alzheimer's complications are coming to get you. That could be a future that we might have. It'll be an interesting future. I look forward to it, but it'll present a lot of challenges. Next slide. One of which is this, is short of the ability to cure the disease, how are we going to live with the disease in its advanced stages? This is Margot Bentley. She's a nurse, and this is her advanced directive. And she decided, and it's in the text there, that if she ever developed dementia and no longer could feed herself, she shouldn't be fed. And then she would pen in there, actually go ahead and don't say it that way. She said, I request that I be euthanized. So she had a pretty strong vision of how she wanted to be cared for. Next slide. And there she is with her advanced stage dementia. The bottom line was the Canadian courts said you can't write a directive to not be fed. Feeding is not medical care. Advanced directives apply to medical care. I bring Margot Bentley's story up. I think it's sometimes I regret at the end of a talk bringing it up, not because it's ethically, morally difficult, but it demands far more attention. But it is this type of conversation, which unfortunately does dominate chit chat and whatnot about how I'd want to be cared for with advanced stage dementia. And I would argue if our solution are these kind of advanced directives, we've done something seriously wrong as a society and failed in our ability to organize a healthcare system that cares for people. Family members of my patients with advanced stage dementia, if I ask them, will tell me, oh no, there are moments when she's still there. There are moments when we connect. And I would submit we have to bring those conversations out. And instead of saying, well, the solution to advanced stage dementia is Margot Bentley directives in court cases. Next slide. Next slide. It doesn't help though, when you see ads like this. Now, this is an ad by Biogen, and Biogen has pulled this ad, and I'm going to keep on punishing them for even thinking of doing it. And for anyone else out there in pharma as well, this is your warning. If these are the kind of ads that you want to put out to raise awareness about Alzheimer's disease and your product, I'm going to punish you. And I'm being a little mean. Even though he's just started to forget where he's traveled, amyloid beta has been accumulating long before symptoms appeared. Abnormal amyloid beta accumulation in the brain is a key characteristic of Alzheimer's disease pathology. What does this look like? Is this a pleasant image? Do you feel happy looking at this? No, you feel scared. This is a horrible, horrifying, horror story image of a man who is becoming half dead. And when a pharma company wants to sell their diagnostics and treatments for this disease by using zombie metaphors, that's inappropriate. Now they've pulled this ad. They said we were thinking, whatever, I don't know, but don't do it again. Next. So thanks a lot. It was a lot of fun. Honestly, most of what we need to do, we can do it. We just have to get united around it and stop fighting. That's all. Thanks.